My name's Lindsay Tanner. I'm a former politician, but don't hold that against me. And of course we have with us tonight George Megalogenis, who is the latest contributor to the quarterly essay series under the title of Trivial Pursuit. And I gather that George will be available to sign copies of this latest quarterly essay somewhere down the back after this session. We are aiming to go for about an hour, and about roughly 2/3 of that will consist of a discussion between George and myself where we will be cross-dressing. I will be asking the questions and he will be avoiding answering my questions in true style. So I'll demonstrate what a good journalist I am and he'll show what a great politician he would have been. Now I can assure you, read George's quarterly essay, and I've got a number of questions to ask him about it. And once we have got to about, as I say, around about 2/3 of the way through the hour that is allocated for this evening, then I will throw to you in the audience. We do have some ushers wandering around in very sort of colourful outfits who I gather have one or two microphones, and I'll be relying on them to tell me who to give the call to, but we'll get to that in due course. I will be keeping an eye on my BlackBerry because it is also a clock, amazingly enough, and it will tell me when it's about time to throw to you. So I will start the discussion with George with a question about a theme that I think is quite significant in his quarterly essay, which the thrust of the essay being that we've reached a kind of stalemate in Australian politics where the era of reform is over and we're now in an era of not much happening and a lot of trivial things going on. The theme of impatience strikes me as being a strong undercurrent in his analysis. It's reflected in the fact that we've had something like 7 different leaders of our major political parties within the last 4 years or so, and it's reflected in observations like his point that the rapid turnover of leaders tends to have coincided with the shift of Newspoll being published fortnightly rather than, as it previously was, monthly. So I'd first like George to expand on this theme about how our politics now seem to be governed by an impatience at all levels, in the community, in the political parties, in government, and that is generating the erstwhile bad things that he has talked about in his quarterly essay.
Thank you, Lindsay, and I will resist the temptation to throw questions back at you, but you never know, I might lose my discipline about the halfway mark. This thing on impatience, I had a good look at our electronic library and had a look through the Newspoll cycles and try to match them up with turnover of leadership. Now, through the 80s, as Lindsay pointed out, we were a monthly polling outfit in the Australian, started in 1985, and before then the Bulletin had the big poll. Now, polls have in the past played a role in knocking off leaders. John Howard missed a 17%. Why does this man bother? Was a big front cover article in the Bulletin in 87, and he pretty much lost his leadership. That was part of the reason why he lost his leadership. It wasn't the only reason he lost his leadership. But what we observed from the early 90s, once we went fortnightly, you couldn't go through a term of Parliament without there being a leadership change, and this was quite an unusual pattern. It began towards the end of the 80s, early 90s with the recession, so you could say the big economic shock might have been the thing that did it. But once we got into recovery, it continued. So it wasn't the economy that was driving this thing, hip pocket concerns one side and then another side not being able to get traction with the public because the public were scratchy. It was the way we went about reporting, keeping score, and then reporting again, the business of politics. Now, at some point, it certainly didn't happen all overnight. I think this is all part of a longer trend. I think politicians started to watch what we wrote. We started to watch them watch us. We saw that they reacted to the polls. So what did we do? We read their actions through the polls. And I think it's been a bit of a race to the bottom. No single individual's to blame. I think the medium, when we talk about media, I think we're talking about technology and this sort of incessant demand for new information. And I think in this era, I'm going to skip forward now to the more recent period, since about September 11, 2001. The technology has accelerated. Media cycle we're in now is what? 24-hour news cycle. There has to be something new almost every hour now. Now, the business of politics can't operate on something new every hour. This is a very different sphere that we're in now. And what resonates through all this white noise? Not words, because there are a trillion of them, but numbers. Is the government up? Is the government down? Is the opposition up? Is the opposition down? Policies get announced. First thing we do, we put a poll on the field. Do you like this thing? Yeah, all right. You ask a question again the second time, do you like it? I don't know. Hang on a minute, the government's in trouble. This thing doesn't look like it's popular. A couple of weeks later you say, well, they've got to ditch this. And that's really, it's tail wagging the dog thing, and it's technology reasserting or asserting a sort of level of veto over the substance, not just of politics, but also political reporting. Now, I don't know how you think your way out of this. This impatience that Lindsay refers to is now part and parcel of everyday life. Now that we're living a lot of our lives through the computer, we are almost at this sort of pre-Renaissance state now where a bit of information flicks up, I have a look at that, okay, I've got to sit down, I've got to write something, I've got to send this note, hang on a minute, something's just flashed up on my screen, hang on a minute, I've got to get up, make myself a cup of coffee. This sort of thing that we're involved in now is not healthy. But I think a lot of people recognise it, and I think a lot of people have been living it for a while, and I know you've made this point in the past that the media itself is making it harder for governments to do stuff. Like I say, I don't think it's any journalist's fault, I don't think it's any news organisation's fault, I think it's just the volume of words and the numbers and the noise that comes with it, almost exercising a technology-based veto over long conversations.
There's a book by Ian Ward about the Australian media which has a table of leadership challenges, state and federal, from I think about the mid-1970s through the late 1980s. And one of the extraordinary things about this table is that there is a success or fail tally against it all, and there's probably 20 or so challenges, and almost all of them succeed. Almost all of them succeed. And it now seems that the best way to win office from opposition is to become opposition leader as close as possible to the election which you're contesting.
Before someone comes after you.
Yeah, that's right.
On your own side. Yeah.
So Bob Hawke managed it brilliantly. Colin Barnett managed it brilliantly. And there are many examples, of which Kevin Rudd is one, of people who've successfully won government from opposition, in some cases after quite a lengthy period of their party being in opposition, with only a relatively short time in opposition. Do you think the circumstances are now such that you're actually better off to bide your time? If, for example, you've got a leader who's been unsuccessful in an election, you're better off to let them stay in office post the election for a year or two, then knock them off, rather than become opposition leader straight away?
You haven't let go of politics yet, have you? This is a good strategic question. What works, obviously, is the challenge that turns up within a year or as close as possible to an election. Doesn't always work, of course, because Mark Latham didn't work.
True.
But we know Tony Abbott came close. We know John Howard came close. Well, came close. He won in a landslide in the second time around. And we know Kevin Rudd won quite a comfortable majority for Labor in 2007. Would you wait? Well, I think one of the problems of all these constructions now is if you lose an election and you think the result doesn't matter because you can turn your leader over, your opposition is never going to be ready for government when its turn comes. So the business of winning, everybody knows that game now, and I think both sides have got roughly the same information. They've got roughly the same take on the electorate. Because there isn't a policy contest between them, we know that we're actually in this sort of perpetual turnover phase. So you could you could imagine a scenario where Abbott got up, either as minority government or with a small majority of his own, and they would have lasted a term.
Well, in fact, the last person to win government at the national level from opposition after serving a full term as opposition leader was Gough Whitlam.
Yep.
So I think that does speak volumes for
this
and he
dynamic. Gough, interestingly enough, had 2 terms of remaking a party before he was ready to govern. This idea of coming from opposition with an alternate program for government is very old hat now, and that is really quite disappointing to my mind as an observer, because we've obviously just gone through a period with a Labor government that had a lot of good sound bites, had a lot of policies. There were over 600 promises made in 2007. I think you itemised them all at some point. And
unfortunately, wasn't the high point of my political career having to do that.
But this was essentially campaign material rather than a program for government, the way it translated. We won't go into too much detail on what went wrong in the first term because you're asking the questions, but this is, in a sense, I think politics has learnt the easier of the two games, which is the game that the media always understood, which is how to create a distraction, how to make a lot of noise, how to basically hound somebody out of a pre-existing position. The thing now, with all this noise around, is who can think their way through a campaign period and actually govern with some authority.
Well, I suppose that's my next question. Is there going to be a swing back? Usually in politics, when people start to get unhappy about something, a pattern of how things are occurring, then that becomes the fuel for a bit of a swing of the pendulum back in the other direction. So do you sense that there is likely to be a shift back?
I think there has to be a shift back because I just can't see us running this sort of 3 litres a term churn. I just can't see it because I actually don't see the point in coming to work if I were in politics, knowing that at best I get a 1.5 year shot at the leadership, and then somebody's coming after me, and knowing that the person that comes after me is going to have just as rotten time as I did. I think at some point there's going to be a collective reassertion of the authority of government and also the authority of an alternate government, the authority of ideas in opposition. But I don't see it happening anytime soon because one thing that the hung parliament has done is basically crippled both sides. I think both Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard looked at the election result and said, hello, they really don't like us. And anyway, I might... I think the way both of them have, I know they're both exhausted, but and in fact both sides are exhausted. I think they're not that confident yet how to reapproach the electorate, having just been given, a collective kick up the backside.
Now, both yourself and Paul Kelly and one or two others have been putting a view that the age of reform is over, and I think you identify around the turn of the century as about the time when national governments in Australia doing big, hard reform things that are politically challenging just ground to a halt. I'd like to tease out a bit of that material. And first I'd like to ask you, what do we mean by reform? It's one of the things I've kind of grown to understand over the years is that your reform is my outrageous attack on human rights and vice versa. And so what somebody sees as reform, somebody else is likely to see as outrageous, retrograde, whatever. So I think there is a bit of a reform is in the eye of the beholder here. So if we are to be asserting that there was a pattern of activity from, let's say, the early 1980s through to the late 90s or around the turn of the century that we describe as hard reform, and we're saying that that's kind of ground to a halt, well, what definition of reform are we using? What's our frame that tells us what we're talking about?
Yeah. When I think reform, and I don't obviously just think economic policy, I think anything that a government can see a long-term gain from, a national interest, but is not going to pass the first test of an opinion poll. But through debate, argument, adjustment, adaptation, public and government come out the other end with a better sense of why this thing was done, and the thing actually, with the benefit of hindsight, gets a tick. Now, we use GST as a pretty good example because it never satisfied any opinion poll. The Australian threw so many polls, so many different polls at the GST. Lindsay, you'd remember this. I framed half the questions, and each time the Labor people would come back to me and say, we're almost there, we're almost there. Not because we're tricking up the questions for a Labor result, but each time these questions were asked of the GST, it looked like it was a dog of a policy. Now, something happened. I mean, obviously in 2001, the Tampa came on the horizon and that wiped that debate clean. But at the 2001 election, and I have seen Labor's internal research, and Lindsay Tanner can't comment on this because he may or may not have seen it, the idea of rolling back the GST was a net negative for Kim Beazley. The idea that an alternate government would walk up to the people and said, look, you've just gone through this thing, 4 years, well, it was actually a 25-year journey by the time it became accepted, but by the way, I want to undo this whole thing. People, once they've been through these debates, do move on. I think climate change is going to be one of these issues when somebody finally nails it, we'll wonder what the fuss was. Because I think a good 2 or 3 years into the GST implementation, people were wondering what the fuss was about. Now, as I say, my definition of reform is something's obviously got to have a national interest. I don't score the GST highly in terms of its mechanics, but I do score the GST highly in terms of its politics. I mean, it wasn't intuitively popular, but it did give the government, the coalition government, an idea that it was standing for something, and it did shore up a bit of revenue. They chucked it away, obviously, in good times and didn't complete the transaction, to my mind, but, I'm in the media, I'm in the sort of hard bastard part of the spectrum, so I assume that governments don't know what they're doing. I don't assume that, but I'm always going to score them poorly, and it's obviously going to give you a window into how we go about our business and how we're making these things worse, not better. But as I say, it's something that is intuitively hard because it's going to force people to adjust. But at the other end of this process, the place has to be better off. So I don't believe in reform for its own sake. I certainly, I'm with the majority of the Australian electorate that work choices, A, wasn't sold to the electorate, but B, in its implementation was, close to the worst piece of public policy that we've seen in the last 30 years in terms of what it was trying to do to people's everyday lives. I wouldn't call that reform, because at some point there's no macro GDP upside that's going to cancel the fact that most people go to work and feel like they're going to have a crappy time. So, I mean, that's just to give you a sense of balance there.
One of the great difficulties in this debate, I think, is that there are always voices advocating particular kinds of reforms who tend to go missing or are in fact recalcitrant when other kinds of reforms are put in place. So, for example, it's taken the business community a very, very long time to get engaged with what is clearly the number one terrain for microeconomic reform in Australia, and that is the federal-state schmozzle. Now, to the BCA's credit, Business Council's credit, they have become pretty hardline and pretty strong on that. So everybody in these debates is always pursuing self-interest and partisan positions, and there is no purity. So how do politicians that are being berated for being timid and reactive and watching opinion polls, how do they manage to put together a coalition of support or commitment to serious reform when the various groups in the community out there will always be barracking for their reform and fighting hard to stop the other guy's reform?
Now, some of us are probably old enough to remember that the 80s and the 90s was preceded by the 70s, which was our worst decade. Now, a lot went wrong over the course of that decade.
I had a lot of fun in the 70s.
Yeah, we all had a lot of fun as kids, but the model broke. The Australian model broke, and we came out of a second recession within the space of 5 or 6 years with double-digit inflation and unemployment. At that point, and Bob Hawke might beg to differ because I think he thinks his genius helped bring the nation together. I think at that point, all vested interests looked at the national balance sheet and said, we can't continue down this path that we're on, which was essentially every vested interest for themselves. So you had a systems failure leading to some substantial cross-party and cross-sector push for reform. We obviously don't have that now because we're obviously in a lot better place financially. The place hasn't had a recession for close to 20 years. In fact, the anniversary of the recession we had to have press conference falls next week. So the 20th anniversary for fiscal train spotters. So that is a long time.
Bet you none of you knew that.
That is a long time for a society to be pretty much growing off its own steam. There are a lot of people who just don't want to be touched. Now, to go to your question, because I'm obviously doing a bit of a scene set for why things did work a bit better in the 80s and 90s, there was a collective interest. How do you get it done this time? Well, the last time it was done, and the last time it worked, it wasn't the last time it was tried, because the Labor government obviously did try a couple of things. The last time it was done, going back to the GST, John Howard had ruled out the GST going into the 96 election. He said never ever, it was dead, and was over his dead body. Of course, within a year, the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Australian Council of Social Services got together and said, well, the budget's in a mess, we've got to fix the revenue stream so we could start spending on our people. Business wanted a simple tax system, the welfare lobby wanted greater government spending. That was a sort of coalescing of interests which happened ahead of the government, but I think John Howard obviously allowed this thing to run ahead of him. Now, how does the government do it today? I think at some point somebody gets behind closed doors with people that they think are interested in the national interest and work out whether they want to put the thing up the flagpole in the first instance. And it may be that governments have to lose this sense of, sole authorship of reform, and it may be that they might have to find a way that it's not presidential genius that it's going to get us from A to B, but that a government can marshal a number of groups, make a few of them think that it was their idea. I mean, there are some dummies in the corporate and in the welfare lobby sector that do think that every original thought in Australia has come from them. At some point you might be able to let them think this, but I can't see it working any other way, because you need the buy-in at the start from these groups. The idea of a top-down reform agenda from government doesn't quite work at the moment, because Parliament and the government doesn't have the authority to be able to say, here's what I want to do, are you with me or against me? That obviously didn't work in between 2007 and 2010. That means reimagining the way some of these debates are run, and probably, a government or even an opposition, because you can move these things from opposition, being big enough to share the credit with other parties.
Without casting judgment on your thesis about the end of the age of reform, I think there's something that I've had a view of for several years that I think is in your perspective here I'd like to get your view on, and that is the Ross Garnaut great complacency thesis.
Mm-hmm.
For those who are not aware, Ross Garnaut made a speech, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, where he dubbed the current environment, the atmosphere, the politics of Australia, the great complacency. Now, I actually think he's bang on the money here, and that it is not a coincidence that reform has become harder for politicians of either party in the wake of the mining boom. And I look back to the 1980s and think, well, the critical thing here was that you had, within a relatively short period of time, the dreadful recession of 82, 83, the stock market crash, 87, the Banana Republic incident in 1986, the Australian dollar falling to 47 cents US. Then, of course, you had another very, very deep recession in 1991. In my view, the mood in the Australian community was receptive to dramatic, unpleasant things, because people had a feeling, well, yes, it is broke. And we may not particularly like what Bob Hawke and Paul Keating are proposing, but what would we know? We're a bit dubious about it all, but we do accept that something has to happen, and it probably has to be something pretty serious. In my view, the "it ain't broke, don't fix it" mentality is one of the 10 commandments of the Australian psyche, if there are such a thing. Don't ask me what the other 9 are, but I probably...
There are a variation on that, and they probably have something to do with property prices.
Yeah, well, property prices may have something to do with it. So I think one of the great problems that governments of both persuasions have had in confronting these issues in recent times is just a general sense of complacency in the community, which is characteristic of Australia throughout its history.
Yep.
Which I think is the downside of being dealt a pretty good hand by geography and history, and that some of the time we really luck it in, as we have in recent times, and the end result, of course, is that people, I think, tend to be not very receptive to anything being changed dramatically because they don't see the need for it. To what extent do you see that as a factor in the thesis you're putting forward?
Yeah, I actually, Ross is bang on the money on this, because you take the long view of Australian history, take a 100-year view of federation, the decades that stand out, the ones out of the box of the 80s and 90s, either side of that. And if you look at the story since 2001, and there's a particular transaction I have in mind, and I'll just mention it briefly. I think it ended in 2001 when John Howard gave the motor lobby more than they asked for on fuel excise. I think that was the moment where, and at that point, they were obviously in trouble in the polls, that was the moment where lobby groups took a look at the government and realised that the government was weak enough to be able to stop doing things. Now, any lobby group has picked up that lesson. We know that ACTU certainly picked it up with work choices. We know the miners went close to kicking a government out simply because they didn't want to pay more tax. Now, that complacency, obviously there has to be sort of, some public consent for this sort of behaviour, because I think this behaviour is, without sticking up for politics too much, but in this instance I do want to stick up for politics, I think that sort of behaviour of vested interest is totally outrageous. The idea that you could take a government to the wire, whether it was the motor lobby against John Howard, whether it was the ACTU against John Howard again, or whether it was the miners against the Rudd government. The idea that any vested interest group, depending, if it's got a membership base and some seriously deep pockets, this isn't the United States, thank God. That whole idea is abhorrent to most of us in this room, but obviously there's a good 20 million Australians who don't care enough to allow that sort of thing to happen. In fact, they probably enjoyed the sport in the short term. So yes, that complacency is there. Now the thing, I'll give you a half cup full take on this. The thing about the 2010 election result was the electorate was saying, inspire us. Politics said, complacency's afoot, I don't want to scare people, I'm afraid of my own shadow, gee, a poll just jumped the wrong way. What am I going to do? What am I going to say? Well, let's shrink the country, let's talk about boat people, let's have a citizens' assembly. I can't even remember all the other stuff. Now, I've just given up. Well, here's a good one. This one I always have to remind myself of. We'll tax business 1.5% so we can outbid Labor on a paid parental leave. Hang on, that's unpopular. Well, why don't we cut tax by the same amount? That happened to be that was the alternate government's policy.
It's actually 1.7%.
It started at 1.7 and it came out at 1.5. Well, the thing about the great complacency is that the 2010 election result tells you that enough people cared enough to hang the parliament, and that we've got now this breakout movement, unusual in Australia, to the left of the mainstream political party, or the two main parties, that is, for the first time in our history, a pro-reform protest movement that pulls about 10% of the electorate. Now, pro-reform protests we've never had before. I mean, find me an example. One Nation, was that a pro-reform protest movement? I don't think that was. Was the DLP a pro-reform protest movement? Even the Australian Democrats was not a pro-reform protest movement. They were a keep the bastard honest movement. So the position of the Greens at the moment, and it has virtually nothing, and I've seen some exit focus groups that were done for why people voted Green, it almost has nothing to do with, line by line adherence to Green Party mantra. It is this sense that the main parties just don't want to do stuff anymore. And if this is the way that we can shake them up, this is the way we're going to do it. So we've been talking about the idea that the system itself is broken in a way that isn't affecting people at the kitchen table, i.e. the governance system is broken. Now, obviously enough people have picked up on this to be able to affect an election result. So it's not that I want to leave you all on an optimistic note. I'd much rather we're a bit harder on them in the short run so we don't have a repeat of an election like this. But it's possible that the public have already spoken and that there's enough of them that are ready to be inspired that one party or the other might break a habit of a century.